Hello and welcome. This is the 26th annual City Club of Boise Pundits Forum, and let's all hope that it is the first and last virtual City Club of Boise Pundits Forum. My name is Kevin Richard. I'm a reporter with Idaho Education News. I'm a City Club Forums Committee member, and I'm honored to be your moderator again today. I want to thank and I want to welcome our radio listeners who will be joining us at a later date via Boise State Public Radio on KBSX 91.5 and its affiliates throughout southern Idaho and northern Nevada. I'd also like to welcome students from our local universities and high schools, as well as the legislators who are joining us today. Today's program is available to our audience in large part because of our City Club partners and sponsors. I would like to take a moment to thank the organizations that help us achieve our mission to ensure compelling conversations, engaged citizens, and a dynamic community. Our premier sponsor is Northwest Nazarene University and the NNU College of Business. The Pundits Forum is sponsored by ACLU of Idaho, the Boise State University School of Public Service, and Conservation Voters for Idaho. We also receive support from these Forum Series sponsors: AARP of Idaho, Bank of Idaho, Climatech Corporation, Echelon Group, Micron, Pacific Source Health Plans, Small Mine Development, and St. Luke's. The City Club of Boise also receives grant funding from the Idaho Humanities Council. Thank you also to our media sponsors and partners, which include Boise State Public Radio, 670 KBOI Radio, the Idaho Statesman, Idaho Public Television, and our university partners, the University of Idaho, Boise State University, and Northwest Nazarene University. Finally, I'd like to thank the members of City Club of Boise, the individuals and organizations who understand that in difficult times, and maybe especially in difficult times, the need for us to find common ground, to listen, and to learn from each other is unwavering. Thank you for your support, and if you're listening today and you're not yet a City Club member, I would encourage you to join today. Well, so we promised that this year would be different, and it certainly is. And I know we all wish that we could be together in the same room for this program. One benefit of the virtual format is that we're able to connect with people beyond the Treasure Valley, and that's where we're going to start this afternoon. On Tuesday, I had the chance to interview former Senate President Pro Tempore Brent Hill, who spent 20 years in the legislature, retiring in 2000, and Representative John Rusche, who spent 12 years in the legislature and served as House Minority Leader from 2004 to 2016. I wanted to talk to them remotely about the issues facing the legislature, and here's our conversation. Senator Hill, Representative Rusche, thank you both for taking the time to be with us. So it goes without saying that we've never seen a backdrop like this for a legislative session. A global pandemic, political unrest. That said, what can legislators draw from to navigate a session like this? How do they manage this? How do they work through this? Senator Hill, why don't you begin?
Okay, well, thank you. And thanks for having us here today. You know, it is tough. This is a hard session, but every session is hard. Every session has its own challenges and so forth. And so they just draw from the same thing they have to every year. And that is depending on each other. As you know, we're a citizen legislature, and as such, we learn to rely on one another for our expertise and so forth. I think there's going to need to be some extra effort put into, I guess I'd call it civility, showing mutual respect for one another. There's a lot of frustration out there in the public, but that flows over into the legislature as well. A few contentions between the executive and the legislative branches of government that might cause some problems. We just need to watch out for those things and try to avoid things that are going to distract from getting the people's business done.
Representative Rusche?
Well, I think that, again, I'm grateful for the opportunity to talk to you all. And I think Brent's correct about the real need for civility. And thinking kindly of the people who are there trying to represent their districts, and in the case of the executive of the state. But I think looking truly to how they best serve the greatest number of people, I think that has to be a lodestone for people.
Well, let's jump into that question of separation of powers. Senator Hill, you were there in August. It was your final chapter as an active legislator.
For the special session.
Right, for the special session, which set the stage for what we're starting to see unfold in January. From a Republican lawmaker's perspective, why is this so important? What are your colleagues hoping to accomplish?
Well, I don't want to speak for my colleagues particularly, and I'm not there to vote this year. So, but I think that we have a different kind of emergency here than what we've dealt with before. Many of the laws were written to protect, for emergency provisions in case of a nuclear war or some physical catastrophe. This is an invisible enemy that we're dealing with. And so many of those laws need to be updated in order to provide the governor the proper authority in a situation like this, while not taking away the authority that he needs to have in those other situations as well. It's a fine line to walk. But I think that those things need to be looked at. The legislature's been talking for a long time about being able to call itself into a special session without the governor having to do that. This seems to be an appropriate time to discuss that as a possibility.
Representative Rusche is a Democrat. Do Republicans in the legislature have merit for some of what they're talking about here, or is some of it just, is the pushback going too far?
I think the pushback is going too far. It's max of power struggle between the executive and the legislative. And frankly, all of the expertise and knowledge about the particular issue of the pandemic and public health systems does not reside with part-time legislators from throughout the state. Other than Fred Wood, I don't know that there's any positions there. And it just really bothers me that the legislators feel the need to take over and control. Of course, as being a minority leader for a long time in the Idaho House, I'm used to having them want to have their way on everything. So.
I'm going to stick with you, Representative Rusche, and maybe ask the most obvious and salient question right now. As we record this on Tuesday afternoon, we've received word that a Senate attaché has tested positive for coronavirus. Is this, as a physician, should the legislature even be meeting, and is there a way for the legislature to meet safely?
I think there is a way to meet safely. And it involves technology, distance meetings. I mean, many of us have had a year's worth of distance meetings for committee meetings or whatever. I do think there's known public health safety issues about distancing and mask wearing. And I also think it's possible to identify what is the absolutely essential that you have to meet together to do and put everything else up until they're vaccinated. For example, if they work on a constitutional amendment this year, it isn't going to hit the people's vote until 2022. That is not an essential thing to do at this time.
Senator Hill, you were there in August, and the virus was spreading rapidly then, as it's doing so now. Did you feel safe at the time, and do you feel like your colleagues are safe meeting?
Well, safe is kind of a relative term. I've got a chief of staff in my new position with the National Institute for Civil Discourse who just tested positive yesterday, and she's been as careful as can be. So I was also there through November, which is when my term ended. And so I was involved in a lot of the precautions that are being taken, and many of them even since that August meeting. There have been air purifiers installed. We have formatted the committee rooms and so forth so that we can have social distancing, not only for the public, but for the legislators as well. And so there are a lot of safety factors that are being followed. But I agree with John that we need to look at all possibilities there. It's pretty easy right now, maybe, to say, well, we're not going to allow voting from a remote location or even from another place within the Capitol. But you get 4 or 5 or 6 or more legislators who end up testing positive and have to be quarantined, and start saying that none of them can participate in this process, which they've signed up to do and have been elected to do themselves. You may see the legislature take a different tune there.
How quickly do you think the legislature can respond and react in real time to an outbreak?
Well, I think they can respond very quickly. Of course, when people become exposed, it's a while before they start showing symptoms. But as far as responding, it requires a change in the rules to allow things to be done remotely. It requires a 2/3 majority to change a rule, but that can be done within moments if the need arises and if the support is there to do it.
Representative?
Well, my feeling is it isn't the time or difficulty or even the technology that's the issue. It is the understanding of the pandemic, what it means, not just to members, many of whom are older than me, but also to their families and people in their communities. And so it's a question of will. It isn't a question of technology.
In any other year, the story of this session would be this record surplus, this $600 million surplus that awaited legislators when they arrived earlier this month. And that may still be a big issue, but I wanted to get perspective from both of you about what the governor has laid out in terms of how to address that surplus, in terms of tax relief, in terms of funding for transportation and infrastructure, funding for another round of teacher pay raises. Senator, what was your takeaway from what the governor laid out, and what do you think the prospects are that it'll find support at the legislature?
Well, the legislature is always looking for ways to return money to the citizens and so forth. The thing that I think we need to keep in mind with Governor Little's proposal is much of that is one-time money. Those are one-time transactions because there is a surplus there. But rather than passing laws that are going to have ongoing consequences, he's taking that surplus at this point and he's returning some of it in the form of tax relief. He's putting it into infrastructure and teacher pay and so forth. But these are not necessarily ongoing things. So I think he's still trying to be very, very cautious. There's a huge amount of uncertainty there. We've been very fortunate since this pandemic started. Many states have not been so fortunate. And so we need to be careful. There's still a long time ahead of us where we're going to just experience a lot of uncertainty. And so I think he's being careful to not do something that can have some long-term consequences that could harm us if things don't go as well as we hope.
The centerpiece of it all, Representative, is $455 million of possible tax relief, one-time and permanent tax relief. What was your reaction to that?
Is it my turn? My reaction?
Yes.
Well, this is a story that I've seen repeated over and over, that the governors and the legislature pleads poverty. So they cut back, hold back, and then they have a surplus. And then, of course, that surplus has to be distributed back to the taxpayers, oftentimes as income tax relief, so that the locals who have to support their school end up having to increase their override levies to pay for what it should be a state legislative responsibility. Why are the teachers' salaries an average of $900 lower than they were before, when we have the big I agree with Brent that one-time money should not be spent to ongoing programs. But when you cut ongoing programs and say, well, we're poor, so we can't afford them, that doesn't, and then give it away as tax relief, that doesn't make sense to me.
So I got to ask a doctor for his expertise about a public health situation. Now I'll ask an accountant for expertise about tax policy. Yeah, Senator, we've seen this before too. We've seen governors say, I want tax relief of a certain amount, and I'm going to leave it to the legislature to sort it out and work out the details. How would you want to see that crafted, given that a lot of the money is one-time money?
Well, that's a hard question to ask a former legislator, particularly one who has been as involved in tax policy as I have over the years. I think the governor was wise in leaving that up to the legislature. The Governor Otter did the same thing. He came up with amounts that he would recommend for tax relief, but leave it up to the legislature of how they would craft that. I probably should follow their example and keep quiet about how the legislature should do it. I would say that there's been a lot of work done by an interim committee headed up by, I know Jim Rice on the Senate side, talking about property taxes particularly. They've been looking at all kinds of tax relief, but property taxes seem to be the ones that are hurting the most people, particularly residential property taxes, the families. And so there's been a lot of work put into that. I think they've learned some things, and I think that you may very well see the legislature look to property tax as a good place to use this tax relief, particularly the one-time money.
We're also in the middle of a historic week with what's unfolding this week in Washington, D.C. with a new administration. Representative Rusche, what do you expect to see with this new administration with regard to Idaho policy? How do you think that the change in the White House might affect Idaho policy? And is it too soon to expect much of a change in terms of Idaho policy this session?
I think it's too early to see much of a change for this session. I think you'll see support for the programs, the projects that they campaigned on, support for healthcare, support for education, including likely support for early childhood education as part of the issue. But I expect that the biggest change will be a tone in that, an understanding that America includes a lot of different people, not just the ones who think like us.
Senator, what do you expect to see? And are there areas of concern going into this as a Republican, seeing a change in party in D.C.?
Well, certainly there are areas of concern, but that's true with any change in administration. Just again, what's unknown and how that's going to affect us. This change, this transition here, and this in the power at the federal level comes with special problems this year with the accusations that have been made regarding the elections and just the whole process here has created a great deal of contention that I haven't seen before in my lifetime, and I think that we're going to have to spend some real effort to try to mend those problems. They're within the parties. They're also within the states, and so we need to decide what's really important to us, and that is, coming together, making America an even better place to live and to raise our families and do business and so forth. But that is not accomplished through bickering and trying to discredit one another and so forth. At this point, we've got to move forward, and we've got to move forward together. Not everybody feels that way, and I hope that those of us who do can help bring the others along as well.
And some onus now belongs to the legislature meeting in these difficult times, in these divided times, to model that kind of behavior.
Absolutely. The public is looking towards the legislature. Public servants should be held at a higher standard, particularly when it comes to civility and showing respect, not only for one another, but for the public and for minorities and for, just all across our civilization, treating one another as human beings. We should be setting the examples. The public should be able to expect that. We haven't done a real good job of that.
Representative, you want to take the last word?
Well, thanks. I think that it's important to recognize that facts exist. You can debate policy, but facts are facts. And when you deny facts, it's hard to reach any comedy. And I also think we need to understand that science and expertise has merit. And and the last thing is, you have to listen. And whether you're a Democrat or you're a Republican, you have to listen and listen for understanding. Public service is about serving the public. And the public is not my tribe or your tribe.
Senator, Representative, thank you both for your time and your insights.
Thanks for inviting us today.
Thanks, Kevin, and Brent, good to see you again.
Good to see you. Let's move now to the Pundits section and to your questions. It's great to have this panel together. It's good to have three people who I count as friends, but more importantly, three people who I consider to be some of the sharpest political observers in town. Let me introduce our panelists. You know most of them if you've been here in the past. Betsy Russell is a longtime State House reporter. She is reporting for the Idaho Press, where she writes her encyclopedic Eye on Boise blog. Melissa Davlin is a reporter with Idaho Public Television, and she is the host of Idaho Reports, the weekly go-to source for Idaho legislative news. And Dr. Stephanie Witt is a political science professor at Boise State University. Welcome to all three of you, and thank you for being here.
Thanks for having us.
I want to begin with all three of you with sort of where I began with the legislators, the former legislators. This backdrop, we have never seen anything like this. Between the pandemic and the social unrest, we're less than 2 weeks into this session. Given that backdrop, are you surprised by anything that we're seeing so far, or is it, even in these crazy times, more or less what you would have expected to see coming into this? Betsy, why don't you go first?
Okay, so I am surprised by everything. I'm surprised that I'm sitting here right now in the press room of the state capitol, and that the session is going forward in person without any masking or social distancing requirements, and that a major thrust of legislation that we've seen introduced thus far has been to essentially declare the pandemic over, lift all restrictions, get us back to normal. We just heard Representative Brent Crane on the floor of the House as this session today was beginning saying, our business is to get us back to normal. And in fact, we just saw a vote in the House of 51 to 18 in favor of a constitutional amendment to allow the legislature to call itself back into session whenever 60% of the members of each House choose to, as opposed to the current Constitution, which says only the governor can call the legislature back into session. There were 5 Republicans who joined the Democrats in opposing this, but it still passed by a 2/3 margin. And I think that this session has a very strong sense of reaction to the governor's response to the pandemic and a desire to overturn, overthrow, and prevent anything like that from coming back in the future. That's the overwhelming sense that I have gotten thus far. The other thing that has surprised me, I thought on the first day of session, we would see something like what we saw during the special session with unruly and perhaps even violent protesters, property damage. We have seen none of that. There have been some protesters here, but they've been limited in number. They've been calm, and basically almost nobody else is coming. This place is abandoned because most folks don't want to be here under these particular conditions during a pandemic.
Melissa, what's jumped out at you so far?
You know, to kind of play off what Betsy was saying, as she said that everything has been surprising to her. For me, how I've looked at everything over the past several months is so much of this is shocking, but not surprising. It is after years of charged rhetoric from groups like the 3%ers, like Ammon Bundy. It's shocking, but not surprising that they showed up to the August special session and were as rowdy and destructive as they were. It's shocking, but not surprising that after months of calling for all restrictions to be lifted in defiance of the science, that we now have legislation that's essentially declaring the pandemic over. I hope we have a chance later on to talk a little bit more about the state's coronavirus response, because there's so much there that I think it's important that we explore the legislature's response to this. But it's all shocking and none of it surprising.
Stephanie?
Whoops, Stephanie,
Stephanie,
you're on mute.
you're muted.
There we go. I'm the old person on the panel, so I didn't know to unmute. Yeah.
No, you're not. But you're unmuted, so go for it.
Yeah. So I'm not surprised, given what we saw in the special session. I guess they really telegraphed that they were going to come after public health measures when they were called into special session by the governor this summer, which had a very narrow set of topics that they were called in to look at. And you could kind of feel the frustration of the legislative branch, because they wanted to have these resolutions with a laundry list of things that they would go after, that they weren't allowed to do constitutionally as it is currently framed. So, I remember telling my class, they're going to come loaded for bear for every kind of public health measure that you can think of and try to undo them, which I, as a citizen, feel like is a really terrible set of consequences that we have from the politicization of public health. And so now, it's hard to sort out, is this a well-reasoned public policy choice, or is this a partisan thing now only to attack public health measures? And so I wasn't surprised when the first day everybody starts introducing bills to, attack crowd limitations and restrict who gets to call emergencies. And there are some other things down in the weeds that I think need to be sorted out. For example, who gets to decide whether schools are in person or not? Is that a state level? Is that a school district decision? Is that a public health district decision? And I would be shocked if we get out of the session without public health districts having had almost all their powers just taken away.
I want to
That's
jump.
my happy take.
I want to jump into the separation of powers issue because it's really jumped out at me so far this session. I'm writing a story that I'm going to publish later today about this. By my count, we've had at least 11 pieces of legislation already that deal with some aspect of the state's coronavirus response and some aspect of the legislature's role in emergency response. And we're less than 2 weeks into the session. I'm sure we're going to see more pieces of legislation. Stephanie, this would be a topic this would be an academic topic in one of your classes right now, but we are seeing it in real time at the State House. How does it look differently to you when you're seeing it in real time when we're talking about, opening, closing schools, crowd sizes at a high school basketball game? I mean, talk about the academics of this and the practical applications of it.
I don't think it's that unusual for states to have conflict between the governor and the legislative branch. I think that's relatively common. The focus of those fights tends to vary. And what's unusual in this situation is its focus on public health response. And I assume, I don't know this for sure, but I assume that a lot of the anger behind the fight that we're seeing currently between the governor and the legislative branch has to do with all that money that came in from the federal government to help in the corona response, and that the legislature feels like they didn't get their due chance to decide how to spend that money. And it was a lot of money, and I can see why they feel like that was an awful lot of money to concede to the executive branch to make decisions about without the full legislature's input. But I think every state goes through this to some degree. I think a lot of states are going through it about these public health measures, and we're one of them.
And I should note that at least 25 states right now have legislation in the hopper to deal with emergency response at their state level. So what's going on in Idaho is not terribly unique. It's just our legislators seem to be fairly prolific about it. Betsy, you talked about the vote on the House floor this morning. Not quite a party line vote, a few Republican defections, but mostly along party lines. The debates in committee seem to be largely along party lines. Is that how you see this playing out the rest of the session? Or do you see splits within the Republican Party on some of these issues?
So actually, I think 5 defections among the majority Republicans was fairly high in this debate, given what we've been seeing as far as partisanship and party unity, really, in the way the legislature's been operating. I think I have a question for Dr. Witt, because during the House debate today, Representative Barbara Ehart from Idaho Falls said she does not believe that we have co-equal branches of state government in Idaho. She thinks that the legislature is the main branch, the executive is somehow lesser, and that the judiciary should be the weakest of all and have the least power. And then we heard several other representatives parrot that or agree with it and say that they don't think we have co-equal branches of government, that they think the legislature is the, they themselves are somehow more powerful. And I was flipping through the Idaho Constitution, and I found distribution of powers, and it talks about how no branch shall take on any duties of any other branch. I did not find the words co-equal, but they popped right up in numerous Idaho Supreme Court decisions. Do we have co-equal branches of government in Idaho, or do we not? Is the legislature more powerful?
Well, I'm not really the right person to answer that question. I think that many times the prominence of the legislative branch is inferred from the fact that it is more representative of the wider population than a singular elected official like a governor and or elected / appointed judges. So there's that. At the U.S. level, of course, Congress is the first article, and then the president is second. But I mean, I'm not an attorney, I'm not a constitutional scholar, but in my opinion, the model is that the branches are assumed an equal status.
Melissa, how do you see this playing out in terms of, who ultimately wins this power struggle in your view this session? Considering that a lot of these pieces of legislation, concurrent resolutions, governor doesn't get a chance to sign them or veto them. How do you see this thing playing out?
I think a lot of it is hard to predict right now because there are so many other things on the governor's to-do list, right? He unveiled his infrastructure and education initiatives last week in his State of the State. And so when we look at what the governor wants to do, it's not just coronavirus related. He has a lot on his agenda, and I imagine that there is going to be some push and pull with the legislature. And remember too that these power struggles between the governor's office and the legislature are not new in Idaho. This has been an ongoing theme for the last several legislative sessions. And so I absolutely am not surprised that there are so many pieces of legislation that were already in the hopper. ready to go for the start of the session, we heard during the special session that this is exactly what they were going to do. I keep thinking about something I read last March or April right when the floor was dropping out from all of us, and states across the nation were issuing their own respective stay-at-home orders. I saw someone write that leaders have to know that if these drastic mitigation measures work, people will say that they were overreacting, and leaders have to be willing to be accused of overreaction. And I think about that a lot. I've interviewed Governor Little about his initial stay-at-home order, and if he knew then what he knows now, if he could do it all again, would it be the same? I don't believe it would be, especially that term non-essential is coming back to haunt not just him, but governors and other elected leaders across the nation. That wasn't a term that was unique to Idaho. That was used across the nation and in other countries too. But we need to remember how little we knew about this at the beginning of the pandemic. And I've heard even Republicans who have been very, very critical of Governor Little, and Democrats too, have said that Governor Little has this entire time been in a darned if you do, darned if you don't situation, that he is keenly aware of the economic impacts of certain mitigation efforts. He is keenly aware of the health impacts of a lack of other mitigation efforts. And that balance, I don't think anyone who really has been paying attention envies him and this position. And in December, came very close to needing to declare crisis standards of care in the state. In one meeting I listened to a representative from St. Luke's in Boise saying that at one point they were close to needing to go on divert, meaning that they couldn't admit new patients. And the only reason they didn't was because some of the patients in their care died, which freed up some beds. I mean, this has been a very dire situation this entire time, and there are so many different aspects to balance. The legislature is looking at this partly through a political lens. There is some denial about how serious this health crisis is. I was listening to the debate that Betsy just covered with the constitutional amendment, and one representative said, if this was like the flu of 1918 where bodies are piling up in the streets, then that's one thing. Well, for heaven's sake, we have overflow at the coroner's offices in freezer trucks. There have been situations in other states where they have run out of room to put bodies of coronavirus victims. And so, no, we don't have bodies piling up in the streets. We have the 2021 equivalent of that. And that denial, coupled with this ongoing struggle for power between the branches of government, has just set up this debate perfectly. And I can't predict how it's going to shake out, but I imagine there's going to be some give and take.
But let's talk about the politics of this a little bit, as you kind of set up this next question a little bit. In 16 months, Governor Little is presumably going to be on the ballot again in a Republican primary. A lot of his constituents, a lot of voters in that primary are going to believe that he overreacted to this pandemic, and not overreacted in a good way. I mean, they're going to view the overreaction as an affront, a threat. The election season is pretty much underway, it would seem like, and this is the issue that's going to define it. Anybody want to jump into that? I can't read Betsy's face because of the mask, but I think she's ready to say something.
Well,
I'll defer to Betsy.
I certainly hope the election season's not underway. I'm having enough trouble keeping track of the legislative session right now. But to me, the politicization of the public health issue is really what's standing out right now, more so than what that might foreshadow for future elections. I think that it has impact on all those things that Melissa mentioned that the governor has on his to-do list. We have a governor who is of the same party as over 80% of the members of the legislature. In normal circumstances, one would think that would make it relatively easy for him to accomplish the items on his agenda. But the fact that he is at such odds on a political basis over public health issues with so many members of the legislature will that damage his ability to carry out those processes and those initiatives that he really needs to get done if he's going to accomplish his agenda? And we're also in a very unique situation here in Idaho in that we have incredibly strong state tax revenues coming in. This is not what is happening in most states. Most states are really hurting. Our revenues are so good. Over the summer, when Congress was still debating the next COVID relief bill, and there was debate about should there be more aid for state and local governments, and states across the country were crying out for that aid, our governor wrote a letter to our congressional delegation saying, no, don't give us any more aid. We're doing fine. And why should we bail out all those other states who aren't? Conservative budgeting. That's what takes care of. We also have a lot of growth going on. And of course, the state has benefited from federal aid. But we have a huge surplus, a record state surplus. The legislature is considering tax cuts. The governor is proposing major investments in transportation that could make a huge difference and have been debated for years in Idaho, along with investments in education and other major programs. All of this is colored by this political debate over public health.
Melissa, you spend every day looking at the coronavirus case numbers. We're at a point now, as we watch those numbers come in, where 700-800 new cases a day is a slow day in terms of coronavirus cases. Some days we see well over 1,000. Some days we've seen upwards of 2,000 new cases per day. Do you expect to see legislation regarding the public health aspects of coronavirus, or is the extent of that legislation going to be a referendum on the health districts?
I've kind of asked a few people if they have anything in mind, whether it's regarding the hospitals or public health districts. I think that Dr. Witt is right, that a lot of what we might see is looking at what powers health districts and perhaps other local government entities might have when it comes to the mitigation efforts that we've seen. But as far as COVID specific legislation, I think that everyone until now has been very focused on the balance of powers and also that funding aspect from the federal government, whether the legislature wants to try and walk this fine line of figuring out how to say we're going back to normal, we're getting rid of the emergency declaration, and whether in doing that, they want to say, and also to heck with the federal funding, we don't care that we're losing millions of dollars of revenue, or if they want to try to thread that needle and say, we're canceling the emergency insofar as it doesn't affect all of the money that we're getting because of the emergency that exists. And I do think that the House and the Senate see it differently too. And so that's, at this point, when we're talking about give and take, it's not just between the legislature and the governor's office, it's also between the two different arms of the legislature.
Stephanie, do you envision any legislative levers that lawmakers can pull on the coronavirus issue, especially in vaccine response? Right now, states are pretty much at the mercy of what's happening at the federal level, and so far it's been a pretty spotty rollout from the feds. Is there any role that the legislature can play on this, do you think?
Well, I'm assuming that the legislature will be happier to see the vaccines arriving than they've been to see the public health restrictions arriving. But what the response of the Trump administration had been to let each state figure out almost on its own how to respond to the virus. There was, of course, congressional funding that came down, but not a lot of proscriptive guidance from the feds about how to handle everything. So, that's, depending on your point of view, that's either, 50 flowers blooming and everybody figures out how to do it themselves, or it's a spotty mess with, gaps and every state inventing the wheel themselves. So the governor here delegated the really hard decisions about the continuation of mask requirements, whether or not there would be occupancy limits, and a host of other decisions about managing the public health issues around the coronavirus down to these health districts, which were largely invisible to the public until this really hit. And then the makeup of the boards that govern these agencies became a focus as we see a kind of a collection of elected and appointed officials that sit on the public health boards and really kind of, put the hot potato in their lap, like, okay, you all decide in your area how you want to respond to this. And that does allow some leeway for the different realities of the virus across the state. It isn't the same in some rural areas as it is here in Boise, but in some ways those rural areas have an even harder challenge because they've got only one or two healthcare facilities that they can turn to, whereas we have many here. So, when people do get sick in rural communities, their options are worse. And so far the state response has been that all those rural hospitals will send everyone here to Boise or Twin Falls or probably in Kootenai County. And when those hospitals are full and you can't send the rural population to the urban centers, then I think we've got some really interesting questions. Does that mean you don't get meaningful health care if you're outside of the metropolitan area? So if we don't take care of handling the hospital capacities here in Boise, that has impacts for the whole state because we can't take the patients in from the rural areas that don't have full service hospitals.
A couple of
Anyway, that's it. That didn't answer your question, but that was me going off for a minute.
No.
Well, if I could add to that, so I think that the legislature and the members of the governor's own party put quite a bit of pressure on the governor early on because the initial part of his response to the pandemic was statewide, was top down. And they put great pressure on him to devolve that out to the local authorities, to the cities, the counties, the health districts, the school districts. And the governor did take that step. And so where his initial phase of his response was a statewide response, it then devolved out to a local response that differed around the state and resulted in intense political pressure at the local level. Now, there is one power that the governor has, and it's very clear, and it comes into play with the vaccine, and that is to call out the National Guard. And he has done so, and he's deployed the Guard, and just this week he announced a near doubling of the Guard deployment specifically for distribution and speeding of the vaccine rollout. However, there is a bill pending right now on the Senate floor that the Brigadier General, General Rusche, who is also the head of the Idaho Emergency, I'm going to say it wrong, Operations or Management Office, said will cost us 75% of the funds that are now funding that National Guard deployment.
And could jeopardize could jeopardize vaccination rollout, as I recall him saying the other day.
And the Senate committee passed the bill anyway on a party line vote, and it is up for consideration in the Senate. And this was the version that was designed specifically to avoid that outcome, to try to find a way to, as Melissa said, thread the needle to end the emergency declaration, as many House Republicans want to do, but not endanger the federal funding. Well, according to General Rusche, it did not accomplish that. So it may be that some of the few tools that the governor can still vigorously use right now may be reduced in their effectiveness. Now, if we've got enough money in our state to fill in all those lost tens or hundreds of millions in federal dollars with our state funds, maybe we could fund it that way, but then we couldn't invest in transportation and education and all those other things that were on the list of the governor's agenda at the beginning of the session.
So for our radio audience, I want to remind you that you're listening to the City Club of Boise's annual Political Pundits Forum. We only have about 12 minutes to go here and a lot to get to. Betsy, you alluded to the $600 million surplus that this legislature has inherited. The governor has laid out some fairly ambitious goals in terms of tax relief, infrastructure, some investments in education, maybe not a whole lot of new investments in education. Give us a sense of how you think that that's going to play out, given that the legislature isn't really diving into it too much quite yet.
Right. Well, I mean, they've begun their budget hearings, and the governor has brought a series of supplemental appropriations, which are spending that would happen right now within the current year, and place those before the budget committee. And they're actually going to be voted on tomorrow morning, those supplemental appropriations, at least 7 of them, and they are significant. And this is to accomplish his Building Idaho's Future initiative. Basically, what the governor is proposing is to take not really so much the surplus, but the 5% holdback that he imposed this budget year, which turned out not to be necessary because revenues came in so high and we had federal aid and we now have a giant surplus. And instead of giving that back to the agencies that it was cut from, routed into all these initiatives. And so we will see whether, in very significant ways, the legislature is willing to go along with that. Now, in addition to our $600 million surplus, we also have $600 million in rainy day funds. And there had been talk early on when we thought revenues were really going to take a hit because of the pandemic, that they were going to have to tap right into those rainy day funds and clear them out over the next few years to make sure that we don't fall short. Well, if we're not falling short, is there some other use for those rainy day funds? The governor is actually proposing beefing up the rainy day funds more now. And there's quite a bit of talk about future uncertainty. We don't know what the economy is going to do. We thought, all the state's experts thought, the economy was going to take a huge hit and state revenues were going to be terrible right now. They're not. There's still the possibility that that could happen. And while the virus had a terrible surge this fall and into January or into December, it has started to ease off a bit, to the point that just yesterday we saw the governor announce that he's going to allow more spectators at school sports games. Well, that was the major issue driving one of the big bills to gut one of his emergency orders with regard to gathering. So it's all so intertwined. That's not a very good answer, is it?
Stephanie, we've seen this before. Legislature inheriting a large surplus, going big in tax relief, and sometimes the results are mixed down the road as the economy waxes and wanes. Do you see the possibility of that kind of scenario playing out in 2021, setting the stage for problems down the road?
Yeah, I still have some questions about when we're going to feel the effect from the pandemic virus on the state budget. Okay, so this next several months we'll all be filing our taxes based on what we earned last year, right? So for all of those thousands of Idahoans who were laid off from work or lost their job or their gig economy job, however that worked, that's when we're not going to see that until those tax returns and that money is in, over the next several months. So there's kind of a lagged effect to some of our sources, definitely income tax and corporate income tax. Now, the locals rely on the property tax mostly, and that's another thing I would expect the legislature, if they leave themselves time to get busy about, is trying to give tax relief to residential property taxpayers. So how much are we going to be hurting in the next year of state budget because there were so many people not paying income tax and not buying as much stuff because they were laid off during the beginning of the pandemic? So I don't know. There's like the first half of 2020, we don't, a lot of the money that would have come in on income taxes during that period of time, people weren't working. So is there going to be a lagged effect is one thing that I wonder about. But gosh, it seems to me like we could find things that we've been putting off paying for, I don't know, a decade or more on infrastructure and, highways, bridges that are, becoming dangerous. We're hundreds of millions behind every year in maintenance, and we never seem to catch that up. So that when I see, oh my goodness, we have a $400 million or $600 million surplus, it seems to me like, gosh, there's a lot of infrastructure needs that we could be putting that towards, right? And of course, any kind of tax relief that would keep school funding stable and provide property tax relief would be a nice hat trick to see the legislature do too.
And I can't resist putting you on the spot a little bit, Stephanie. I mean, the higher education budget last year was a big fight on the House floor. Could be another big fight again this year. Your boss and the other university presidents have said, if this budget passes, we'll freeze tuition for another year. Are you hopeful that the budget's going to pass, or do you think it's going to be another big battle?
Well, I'm hopeful. and I think that's, I commend the presidents for bringing forward this solution that tries to hold the students harmless in terms of freezing tuition. It is a little ironic as a state employee. We're talking about a $600 million surplus, and I'm giving money back on my paychecks and furloughs here for the next several months, along with everyone I work with. That feels weird. But if the higher ed budgets become an issue, it will be less about the money and more about making some statements about the ways that university programming bother legislators, in particular, like diversity programming.
Let's talk about the strangeness of this session in the middle of the pandemic. And Betsy, you kind of alluded to it earlier on about there just aren't as many people there. There just isn't as much involvement. We've already seen a case involving a Senate attaché reported earlier this week. I want to ask all three of you to talk a little bit about the safety of this session and also the civic engagement of a legislative session when a lot of folks are concerned about participating. Maybe they can participate through remote testimony, maybe not.
Well, remote testimony has been discussed as a way to deal with that exact question. And the legislature received quite a bit of CARES Act funds to upgrade its technology and is now prepared to take remote testimony and did so throughout the summer at interim committee meetings. There was some debate going into this session as to whether the committees would take it or not. In the House, the speaker said that it would be up to each chairman. In the Senate, they said all committees would take it. Most recently, I've been hearing House Speaker Bedke looking a little more positively towards doing that in all committees. So that may be an option, but we haven't seen much of it yet.
Melissa, you're covering most of the session from home, as evidenced by the fact that you have a visitor. Talk a little bit from your perspective about the safety of the session and the civic engagement.
The safety versus the civic engagement is, I think, one of the hardest things to balance right now. And also the ability of some of us to do our jobs. I'm home not just because of safety, but because my children are home as well. My son's doing online school. I don't have daycare for this little guy, my little intern right here, who always loves to cry when I'm live. So here we are. The biggest shame of all of this is it does affect the public's ability to go in and interact. You're not going to have the field trips this year. You're not going to have the homeschool Pi Day events that we always enjoy. That's one of the best parts of the legislature. That's one of the best parts of the State House in Idaho is that the public does have so much access. It's not like that in all states. A lot of times it's very, very closed off. But the safety part of this, with very little mask use, with not much social distancing, for a lot of people I know, and for myself, I'm high risk, and I've talked about this on the show before. The risk is just too much, and so it's a shame that we lose that public engagement and that civic aspect of it. Hopefully this, as you said in your opening, hopefully this is the only year we have to do this, because it's a huge shame. But for me and my family, and for the rest of the Idaho Reports team who is choosing to work remotely, it's the best decision for us.
Stephanie, as an academic, we're at this kind of inflection point where people would probably want to be even more civically engaged than normal, given the issues of the day, balanced against the safety issues. How do you see that playing itself out? Not just this session, but maybe beyond. Does it have a long-term effect maybe on civic engagement?
Well, I think that one of the things the pandemic has taught us is that there's more than one way to do many of the things that we do, whether it's how do we do our work, and we've discovered we can do that in many places and in many formats. I taught in person just before this started, and I said to the room full of masked people, this is weird, but we'll figure out a way to learn stuff. And that's our job right now. And the job of the legislature is to continue to do the business of the people, maybe in new ways. And having testimony remote, actually, to me, seems like you can think of that as an increase in civic engagement or opportunities for that, because instead of having to, get in a car and drive a long way to the Capitol here in Boise, if you live elsewhere, you may have the opportunity to participate without as much cost, without a day off, without a long drive, all of that. So there's a sense in which civic engagement actually increases when anybody can phone in on a Zoom call and listen and maybe say something, whereas they don't have the time or the inclination to come down and stand in a big line to sign up to testify and all of that. So is that the same as it was before? No, but is it inherently worse in terms of allowing our citizens to participate? I'm not sure that it is. I don't like all this stuff either. I'm tired of wearing a mask, and I'm tired of staying 6 feet apart, and I've been spending a heck of a lot of time in my house by myself. But I make that same kind of risk calculation that Melissa talked about. I've got some things that make me at risk, and so I try to balance it out. Can I teach a little bit in person and do a little bit online? Yes. Can the legislature figure out some ways to do some in-person things for those who want to be there and allow remote participation? Absolutely, they can. That's a matter of will, not of technology. Someone said that earlier. That wasn't my thought.
We could easily keep this conversation going for another hour. We certainly have enough good questions from our viewers, but I don't know if Melissa's intern would have that. So I'm going to thank all three of you again for taking part in this panel. As usual, your insights are wonderful and spot on. Betsy Russell, Melissa Davlin, Dr. Stephanie Witt, thank you again.
Thanks for having us.
I'm going to close by taking Pundits' prerogative here for just a second. If you've been at these forums in the past, you know that City Club celebrates civic engagement. You also know that these Pundit panels in the past have celebrated snark and have had some good-natured fun at the expense of the process. I hope we don't get to a point where our debates and discussions of public policy and politics become humorless. But we are at a time where it seems to me, as one pundit in the world, that respect and regard for the other side of the issue is more important than ever. These are difficult times. We're divided times. But I would submit that they're also challenging times, and I would submit that the challenge to all of us is to look inside ourselves a little bit more and to try maybe just a little bit harder to practice civil public engagement. On that note, I want to thank you all for being here under these unusual circumstances, and hopefully next year we will see each other face to face. Thank you. Good day.